Academic integrity from students. It's just one of the many concerns as higher education shifts gears to deliver more online or remote instruction learning with less supervision and surveillance. Will college and university students be more inclined to cheat? Dr. Tricia Bertram-Gallant is an internationally known expert on ethics and integrity in education. She's the director of the UC San Diego Academic Integrity Office and author and editor of several books and papers on the subject. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
There is a difference between remote instruction and online learning. What's the difference, and are there concerns about cheating in both?
Right. So remote instruction, many of us in higher ed in this current situation are using remote instruction to distinguish between what we're doing quickly versus online learning, which takes months of preparation to really take a class that you were doing in face-to-face and put it online in a way that's engaging and interactive. And that takes a lot of time because you have to get used to technology. You have to think about how you're going to present things differently. So it is quite different. We're being very intentional about that because we don't want people's experiences with remote instruction to be translated to online learning classes. Cheating is going to be a problem all the time because students are human beings, and human beings are known to make bad decisions under stress and pressure. And really, everybody's under a lot of stress and pressure right now. It's just the fact of our current situation. And so you take that, plus you take students who are used to being proctored, whether they're in middle school or high school or university, watched while they're doing exams, and now all of a sudden they might not be being watched, and they might not be able to resist the temptations and opportunities that are available to them now that weren't there before.
Well, what does the research tell us about cheating online versus cheating in a traditional setting?
So that's interesting. So the research actually is inconclusive about whether it occurs more or less in either environment. The problem with the research, to be fair, is it's survey research. So we're asking students, are you cheating? Basically, are you doing these behaviors? And there's something called social desirability bias, even in anonymous surveys, where people are hesitant, less likely to admit the bad behaviors that they're engaged in, and more likely to over-report the good behaviors they're engaged in. So we don't actually know. I think that, from experience and from looking into this subject for a long time, I think the best thing is to assume that traditional age students who are still developing morally, cognitively, are going to take advantage of temptations and opportunities, whether they're in person or online in a classroom. We know from decades of research, one of the first studies in 1923 by Hartshorne and May, that cheating's situational, that it's opportunistic. So it's not, the majority of our students are not cheaters, right? They're not intending to cheat on every assignment that you give them, but they do take advantage of situations just like you do when you're driving. If there's no cops around, maybe you're more likely to speed than if there are cops around. Or if you're in a city at a red light and you're trying to decide, do I jaywalk, do I walk against the red light or not? You look around and you see if anybody else is doing it. So students are human beings just like us, so they react the same way to the situational stimuli.
As you say, we're all human, but in an academic setting, what are the contributing factors that lead a student to, say, have someone write an essay for them or cheat on an exam?
There's so many factors. It's very complex. In many of my writings, I talk about there's individual factors, so think psychological factors. Then there's the immediate environment, the classroom, or maybe my peer group. Then the bigger environment of that particular school or college or university, and then societal factors, right? What's interesting about those factors is there's one that's kind of connected throughout all 4 or 5 of those layers. We know from the psychological research that students who are extrinsically motivated, they're motivated by things like grades, degrees, are more likely to cheat than students who are intrinsically motivated, people who are motivated by learning or personal or professional growth. The classroom environment can also emphasize extrinsic or intrinsic motivations by its pedagogy, by the way the assessments are set up. Certainly our universities and schools and colleges emphasize extrinsic motivation, and our society does. We talk about every person needs to get a higher education degree, right? No child left behind. those were all focused on external, what I call false idols of degrees and grades that are meant to represent underlying learning, knowledge, skills, and abilities. But I worry that those have become the goals in and of themselves.
Well, there are certainly checks and balances in place, from plagiarism software to surveillance while writing an exam, but you advocate for a much more productive approach.
Right. So I worry about the surveillance stuff because when we graduate these students and they're doctors and lawyers and accountants and engineers, structural engineers, think about building your buildings that you're sitting in right now. They're not going to be surveilled. They're going to be expected to do their job with integrity and professionalism, even when nobody's watching. So we do need to, in education, balance the reducing temptations and opportunities for students. Again, especially traditional age students, they're young, they're still developing. We want to help them resist temptations and opportunities, but we don't want to graduate people who never cheated because we locked everything down. There's back in the ancient history, there in China, they had an exam that you had to pass, and they literally put them in jail cells to make sure that they couldn't cheat, right? So that doesn't serve us in our future. It doesn't serve our students. It doesn't serve society well. So we do want to use tools to a limited amount, but as a supplement to good course design, good pedagogy, good assessment, good connection with your students. All of the research points out that if students perceive good instruction, they're more likely to learn and less likely to cheat. If they're intrinsically motivated, how do you do that? You focus on mastery, right? Not performance. You design authentic assessments. Active learning is much better than lecturing and then asking people to write a paper or take an exam. So there's lots of things we can do to create a culture actually that's not only full of integrity and learning, but it's inclusive too. So the lovely thing about some of these strategies is they accomplish multiple objectives. And we don't have to just think about, I always say to professors, I don't want you to ask, how can I stop cheating? I want you to ask, how can I best facilitate and assess learning? And asking that question will get you to different answers and lead you to different strategies.
Because ultimately, as a student, if you're cheating, basically you are really only cheating yourself when it comes to having the ability, the skills, and the knowledge to get out into the real world.
Well, they're actually harming a lot of people. So even if it's cheating on a homework assignment, they've now harmed the trust relationship between the instructor and student. Now the instructor maybe doesn't trust any of their students anymore. Maybe they stop giving homework assignments and they only do in-class proctored exams because they're so worried about cheating. It harms the other students in the class, especially if the class is graded on a curve, right? So now all of a sudden I've cheated and I've changed the curve and I've harmed other people. So there's a lot of harm, and it's difficult because if it's only a homework, we pass it off, just like if it's only speeding 5 or 10 miles over the speed limit, it's not really that big of a deal. And also because the harm can be longer term and it's not physical. So I think as human beings, we tend to focus on physical or monetary harm as real harm. Again, it kind of is the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If there's harm down there, we're all extremely emotional and engaged about it. If the harm is longer, harm to learning, harm to self-actualization, harm to future or trust, it's harder for us to grab onto that and see it, especially in the moment. So I would actually say that students are not only cheating themselves, and not just about content knowledge, right? If I cheat on an English assignment and I'm a pre-med student, you're still cheating yourself out of the ability to think, to learn how to communicate better, all of those things. But you are also harming the others around you and potentially the reputation of the university, which will degrade the value of the degree you are so anxious to achieve.
A very interesting way of looking at it. When it comes to assessment tools, are there tools that are a better fit for the online environment, and are educators looking at that?
I wouldn't say better for the online environment, really. I would say there's assessment tools that are better for learning than for cheating, whether you're in online or face-to-face. So, For example, there's research that shows that multiple tests, like quizzing students multiple times over and over again, will lead to better learning and better recall than if you have one exam at the end, right? So one exam at the end not only increases the risk for cheating because it's high stakes, right? If my exam is, worth 60% of my grade, I'm more likely to cheat than if I'm taking yet another little quiz every week. So that should work better in either environment. More authentic assessment. So instead of asking students to write about germs, you could ask students to write about germs given a current context that's going on that everybody's thinking about, right? So making it a lived experience, paying attention to the students' lived experiences and then connecting them to that through the assessment. It's easier to do sometimes than others, right? Basic calculus might be a little harder to do than in some other disciplines. So you have to match it to your content of your course and the discipline. But certainly using a concept we call backwards design, where you start with the learning objectives, start with what you want the students to learn, and then figure out how to help them learn that, how to best facilitate and assess that learning, rather than starting with, okay, I need to have 2 exams and a paper. And believe it or not, that's how sometimes courses are designed. So thinking about it from the learning as the first point will design it better and help you create better assessments that will enhance learning and integrity.
Absolutely. Creating a culture where education is more valued than grades and where integrity matters. Dr. Bertram Gallant, thank you so much for taking some time for NewsPoint today.
Thank you very much.